Rosie Bennett pressed her bare hands flat against the frozen wood of the wagon seat and made herself a promise she would not cry. Not in front of the boy. Not in front of the strangers staring at her from the ranch gate like she was something that had crawled out of the dirt. She had nothing left. No money. No name. No road back. Only a frightened child gripping her coat and a letter in her pocket from a man she had never met promising her a chance. One chance. If this story moves you, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell and follow Rosie's journey all the way to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The wagon stopped just past the iron gate of the Callahan Ranch, and Rosie did not wait for anyone to help her down. She climbed off herself boots, hitting the frozen ground with a solid thud, and she turned back to lift the boy before he could slip on the ice. Noah was 7 years old and small for his age, with wide brown eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that had learned early to stay quiet around strangers. He wrapped both arms around her neck as she set him down, and she kept one hand on his shoulder without looking at him. She was looking at the men. There were 4 of them standing near the fence, ranch hands, sun-cracked faces, muddy boots, arms crossed over their chests, in the particular way that men cross their arms when they've already made up their minds about something. The tallest one, a lean, sharp-jawed man with a tobacco stain on his collar, looked her up and down, the way a man appraises a horse he's already decided he doesn't want. "You the mail-order woman," he said, not asking, stating. "I am," Rosie said. "Rosie Bennett. I have a letter of arrangement with Mr. Callahan." "Uh-huh." The man, she would learn later his name was Garrett, let out a short breath through his nose. He exchanged a look with the man beside him, the kind of look that didn't need words. "He didn't say nothing about a kid." "The letter says housekeeper and cook," Rosie said. "It doesn't say anything about what I can't bring. It don't say you could bring one either." Rosie reached into the front pocket of her coat and pulled out the folded envelope. She held it out toward Garrett with steady fingers. He didn't take it. "Mr. Callahan wrote that letter himself," she said. "I think he ought to be the one to tell me to leave." Another look passed between the men, this one sharper. Then Garrett pushed off the fence post and turned without a word, heading toward the main house. "Wait here," he said, like she was the one being difficult. Rosie stood in the cold with her suitcase at her feet, and Noah's hand finding hers under the folds of her coat. She didn't look down at him. She looked straight ahead at the house. It was a large house, or it had been once. The kind of house that told a story of money spent and then money lost, the porch railing listing to one side, a shutter banging loose near the upstairs window, paint peeling off in long gray strips. There was smoke coming from one chimney. One. In the whole of that big house. "Miss Rosie," Noah said very quietly. "Is he going to say no?" "I don't know yet," she said. "What if he does?" She squeezed his hand once. "Then we find the next road." "There ain't another road. We looked." "There's always another road, Noah. You just can't always see it from where you're standing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm cold." "I know, sweetheart. Me too." The front door opened. The man who came out was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had expected. The letter had been formal and terse, the handwriting of a man who chose his words like he chose his actions carefully and without waste. She had pictured someone older, harder around the eyes. Wade Callahan was somewhere past 30 and not yet 40 tall, in the unhurried way of men who have spent their lives outdoors with dark hair gone a little long under the brim of a worn black hat. His jaw was unshaved. His coat was good quality but old. He walked down the porch steps with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had learned not to hurry unless there was a reason to, and he stopped at the bottom and looked at her. He didn't say anything right away. She let him look. She had spent her life being looked at in exactly this way. Assessed, measured, found wanting, and she had learned a long time ago that the worst thing she could do was flinch. "You're Rosie Bennett," he said finally. "Yes, sir." You came from Amarillo? Yes, sir. That's 3 days by wagon in this weather. 2.5. I pushed through the second night. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, more like recalibration. He looked at Noah. Noah looked back at him with those enormous, watchful eyes. Yours, Wade said. He's mine, Rosie said. It was the only answer she intended to give, and something in her voice made it clear that further questions on that subject were not welcome. Wade seemed to receive that message. He looked back at her. Garrett says you don't have references. I have a letter from the last family I worked for in Lubbock. The father passed in October. The widow moved to her sister's in Tennessee. There was no call for a cook anymore. She reached into her coat again and produced a second smaller envelope. This one she held out until he took it. You can write to her directly if you want to wait for a reply, or you can let me cook one meal and judge for yourself. He opened the envelope and read the letter without expression. Then he folded it back and handed it to her. You understand what the arrangement is, he said. It was not a question, but she answered it like one. Room and board, a fair wage, work in the kitchen and the house. The letter was clear. The letter was also written before I knew what winter was going to do to this place. He looked out at the land around them, the dead grass showing through patchy snow, the leaning fence line, the barn that needed a new roof on the east side. This ranch is not what it was. I want to be straight with you about that before you decide to stay. Rosie looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Callahan, she said, I arrived here in a wagon with a broken wheel, 38 cents, and a 7-year-old boy in December. I think we have roughly the same idea of what not what it was looks like. Something happened to his face then. It was fast, barely there, the corner of his mouth maybe, or something around the eyes. Not quite a smile, but close enough to count. Come inside, he said. He stepped back and gestured toward the porch. Then, almost as an afterthought, he looked down at Noah. You like horses? Noah stared up at him with an expression of someone who has been asked the one question in the world they were most afraid to answer wrong. Yes, sir, he said very carefully. Good, Wade said. We got plenty of those. He turned and went back up the steps without waiting to see if they followed. They followed. The kitchen was the one room in the house that had not given up entirely. There was a cast-iron stove that threw real heat, a long table of rough-cut pine, and enough pots and pans hung on iron hooks along the wall to cook for a dozen men. The floor was clean. The windows were not. There was a smell of old coffee and something burnt that had been sitting in a pan on the back burner so long it had calcified. Rosie set down her suitcase. She took off her coat. She walked to the stove, lifted the pan with the burnt thing in it, looked at it briefly, and set it in the wash basin without comment. Garrett, who had followed them inside along with 2 of the other hands, watched her do this with an expression like a man watching a storm come in and trying to decide whether it's going to be the bad kind or the worst kind. You always make yourself at home that fast, he said. I was hired to work a kitchen, Rosie said pleasantly. This is a kitchen. She turned to face him. What time do you usually eat? Garrett stared at her. 6. Morning or evening? Both. What do you normally have? Whatever Hank can manage to ruin before we get here. Where's Hank now? Out with the cattle. All right. She was already moving, opening the cabinet above the basin, the one beside the door, the cold box in the corner. I'll need to know what you have. Then I'll need a list of what you don't. Lady, Garrett started. Rosie, she corrected, not unkindly. My name is Rosie. Rosie. He said it like he was testing the weight of it. We don't exactly have money to go restocking the whole pantry on account of... I didn't ask for money, she said. She had pulled open the cold box and was studying the contents with the focused attention of a woman doing arithmetic in her head. I asked for a list. I can work with what's here. I've worked with less. She closed the cold box and turned to face the room. Noah. The boy, who had been standing very still near the door in the way he always stood in new places, ready to run, but trying not to look like it lifted his chin. "Come sit at the table. You're going to help me figure out what's in these cabinets." He came and sat without hesitation, the wariness dropping from his small shoulders like a coat falling to the floor. Wade had not left. He was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the front hall, one shoulder against the frame, watching all of this, with an expression that Rosie could not quite read. She had met men like him before, men who had been knocked down hard enough and often enough that they had stopped believing in things. It showed in how they stood, how they watched, how they kept a certain distance between themselves and anything that might require them to feel something. She didn't say anything to him. She didn't try to charm him or reassure him or demonstrate her value in any obvious way. She just went to work. That was all she knew how to do. By 5:30 that evening, she had turned what remained in the Callahan Ranch kitchen into a pot of beef stew thick enough to stand a spoon in a pan of cornbread, with a perfect brown crust, and a pot of coffee that did not taste like something scraped off a barn floor. She had also, without asking for permission, located a second blanket in the hall closet and put it on the cot in the small room off the kitchen that she and Noah would share. The hands came in at 6. There were 5 of them in total, including Garrett lean-weathered men who moved like they were tired down to the bone and had stopped expecting anything to be different. They came in and sat down and looked at the table, like men who have been told there's treasure buried somewhere, and have learned better than to get their hopes up. Then they tasted the stew. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then a small red-haired young man at the end of the table couldn't have been more than 20, with ears that stuck out, and the sincere, uncomplicated face of someone who had not yet learned to pretend, looked up and said, "Lord in heaven, this is the best thing I've eaten since my mama's house." "Thank you," Rosie said from the stove. "You want more?" "Yes, ma'am," he said immediately. "Please, ma'am." Even Garrett ate 2 bowls. He didn't say anything about it, but Rosie noticed. She noticed everything. Wade ate alone at the far end of the table, separate from the men in the way that owners are always separate from the men even when they're sitting in the same room. He ate without speaking. When he finished, he set down his spoon and looked at the empty bowl for a moment, as if the bowl had said something he was trying to work out. Then he looked up at Rosie, who was refilling the young red-haired man's bowl without being asked. "You'll stay," Wade said. It wasn't an offer. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, the same kind of statement the letter had been clipped and direct, and not particularly interested in negotiation. Rosie looked at him. "I intended to," she said. Something passed across his face again. That same barely there thing that might have been the beginning of something warmer than he had allowed himself to feel in a long time. Then he pushed back from the table and left the room. She did not know yet that she had just passed the only test that mattered to Wade Callahan. Not the cooking, not the letter of reference, not the way she'd stood at the gate in the cold without flinching. Those things he had cataloged and filed. What had moved him in some deep and reluctant place was the moment when Noah had sat down at the table to help her. The way the boy's shoulders had come down, the way her hand had rested briefly on top of his head as she passed automatic careless, the gesture of a woman who had touched that head 1,000 times and would touch it 1,000 times more. He had known what it was to be a boy who needed that kind of sureness and didn't have it. He didn't know why he knew it about this particular child. But he knew. He stood on the porch in the cold and looked out at his broken fences and his lean, exhausted cattle and his land that someone else wanted badly enough to cut his wire and scatter his herd and leave threatening notes nailed to his posts in the middle of the night. He had been alone with all of this for 2 years. Alone in the particular way that men are alone when they have people around them, but no one they can put down their armor for. Something about tonight felt different. He wasn't sure yet whether that was a good thing. He turned up the collar of his coat against the wind and went inside. In the kitchen, Rosie was washing up. Noah had fallen asleep at the table, with his head on his arms, and she had laid her coat over his shoulders and was letting him sleep there while she worked. She was humming something very quietly, a small, tuneless sound, the kind of noise a person makes when they've finally stopped bracing for the next thing and can just be in a room for a moment. She didn't hear Wade stop in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He just stood there for a moment watching her wash dishes in his kitchen, like she had always been there. Like the quiet was something she wore comfortably instead of something she was surviving. And then he turned and went upstairs. But he didn't sleep for a long time. The next morning, Rosie was up before anyone else, which meant she was up before the dark had fully let go of the sky. She had the stove lit and the coffee on by the time the first of the hands came in stomping frost off his boots, and she had eggs and salt pork on the table before any of them had fully woken up enough to remember to be surprised by it. Wade came down at 5:30. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, the same way he'd stopped the night before, looking at the scene, as if he expected it to disappear if he looked too long at it. "You don't have to start this early," he said. "I know," Rosie said. She poured coffee into a mug and set it on the table without turning around. "It's ready." He sat down. He drank the coffee. He looked at Noah, who was already awake and eating eggs with the focused, serious attention of a boy who has learned to eat everything on his plate because there may not always be a plate. "How old are you?" Wade asked him. Noah swallowed. "7, sir. Almost 8. "Almost 8, Wade repeated. Something moved in his expression. "What do you know about horses?" Noah's whole face changed. The wariness that lived there like a permanent resident lifted just briefly. "I know you got to approach 'em from the side so they can see you coming. And you got to let 'em smell your hand before you touch their nose. And you can't run near 'em because it spooks 'em." Wade looked at him for a long moment. "Who told you that?" Noah's eyes cut briefly toward Rosie. Back to Wade. "Miss Rosie." Wade glanced at Rosie. She was still at the stove, her back to them, but he could tell from the set of her shoulders that she had been listening to every word. "His mother used to work on a ranch," she said, even and steady. "When he was little, before she got sick." A pause. "Before she passed," Rosie added quieter. Wade was quiet for a moment. Then he drank his coffee. "After breakfast," he said to Noah, If Miss Rosie doesn't need you, I'll show you the stable." The sound Noah made was very small and very fierce. The sound of a child successfully suppressing an explosion of joy because he has learned that joy is sometimes taken back. He nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. Rosie set a second plate of eggs on the table near Wade's elbow. "I don't need him," she said. "Go ahead." And in the long, cold morning light of the Callahan Ranch's broken kitchen, something shifted, something that none of them could name yet, something too new and too careful to be looked at directly. Like a frost-heaved seedling, just barely breaking through hard ground. Fragile. Improbable. But there. Rosie watched her boy's face and felt something close in her chest, something warm and dangerous and long denied. She turned back to the stove before anyone could see it. Outside, the wind had stopped. For the first time in weeks, the Callahan Ranch was quiet. 3 days after Rosie Bennett arrived at the Callahan Ranch, the town of Red Rock started talking. She found out the way she always found out things, not because anyone told her, but because people forgot to lower their voices when they thought someone like her wasn't worth the effort of whispering. She had gone into town with Garrett to get flour and salt pork and a spool of wire for the fence repair, and she was standing at the dry goods counter waiting for the storekeeper to tally up the order when she heard the 2 women behind her. They weren't even pretending to be quiet. "That's her," the first one said. "The mail order woman Wade Callahan sent off for." "Lord," said the second. "He must be more desperate than I thought." Rosie did not turn around. She watched the storekeeper's hands move over the jars and sacks. "She brought a child too, I heard. Some other man's child, or nobody's child. Nobody seems to know." "Wade Callahan," the first woman said, and her voice had the particular quality of a woman who had once wanted something and never stopped being sore about not getting it, is going to wake up one morning and realize he let a woman like that into his house and wonder what on earth got into him. The storekeeper glanced up at Rosie. His jaw tightened slightly. He was a decent man, she could tell that much, but he was not the kind of decent that extended to saying something uncomfortable out loud in his own store. Rosie looked at him steadily. "You got dried apples?" she said. He blinked. Yes, ma'am. Back shelf." "I'll take a pound of those too." She turned, walked to the back shelf, found the dried apples, and brought them back to the counter without once looking in the direction of the two women. Her face was smooth, and her hands were steady, and she felt the familiar burning behind her eyes that she had learned a long time ago to convert into something useful. She carried it home and made apple cake. The hands ate it without a word, but the young red-haired one, his name was Tommy, she'd learned. Tommy Briggs, 21 years old and homesick in the particular way of young men who would die before admitting it. Tommy ate 3 pieces and then looked up at her with such naked gratitude that she almost laughed. "My mama made apple cake," he said. "I know," Rosie said. "That's why I made it." He stared at her. "How'd you know that?" "You talk in your sleep," said Garrett from the other end of the table. "Every man in the bunkhouse knows your mama made apple cake." Tommy turned red to the tips of his outsized ears. The other men laughed real laughter, the loose kind, the kind that didn't have anything mean in it. Rosie watched it happen and felt the tight thing in her chest loosen just a fraction. She was building something here. Slow and quiet, the way she'd built everything in her life. Brick by brick, meal by meal, small kindness by small kindness. She knew how it worked. She had done it before. You fed people well, and you listened when they talked, and you didn't make them feel stupid for needing things. And after a while, they stopped treating you like a problem and started treating you like a person. Most of them, anyway. Wade came in late from the south pasture that evening, later than usual, with mud on his boots and something closed and hard in his face that hadn't been there that morning. He sat down at the table, and Rosie put a plate in front of him without a word. He ate without looking up. After the other men had gone out, and Noah had been settled in their room with his book, Rosie sat down across from Wade with a cup of coffee and said, "What happened today?" He looked up. "Ranch business." "All right," she said. He went back to eating. She waited. She was good at waiting. After a minute, he set down his fork. "Clifford Hayes sent a man out this morning. 2nd time this month." "Clifford Hayes, the oil man." "Clifford Hayes, the man who wants this ranch," Wade said. "He's been after it for 2 years. Keeps sending someone out to tell me the offer's still on the table, like I'm going to change my mind if he asks enough times." "Are you—" His eyes came up fast and sharp. "No." "Then why does it put that look on your face?" A beat. 2 beats. Something moved in his jaw. "Because this morning his man didn't come to talk. He came to count." Wade pushed back from the table slightly. "He sat on his horse at the property line, and he counted my cattle, and he wrote it down in a little book. He didn't say a word, just counted and wrote away." Rosie was quiet for a moment. "That's a threat. That's a man who already knows he's going to win and wants me to know he knows it." "Do you believe that?" "I believe he's got money and lawyers and men who do what they're told, and I've got 60 head of cattle and 4 ranch hands and more debt than I want to think about." He looked at her directly. "So yeah, some days I believe it." Rosie wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "You haven't sold yet." "No." "You've had 2 years to sell, and you haven't." "No." "Then you've got something he doesn't," she said. "Whatever that is. Stubbornness, spite, love for this land? I don't know, you've got it. And that counts for something." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was starting to recognize, the expression of a man being offered something he wants badly, but has taught himself to be suspicious of anything that comes toward him without conditions attached. "You always talk like that," he said. "Like what?" "Like everything's got an answer if you just come at it straight." "Usually does," she said. "The hard part is coming at it straight." He almost smiled. Almost. Then he picked up his fork again and finished his plate, and Rosie sat there across from him in the lamplight and let the quiet be what it was. Not uncomfortable, not empty, but the kind of quiet that meant 2 people were in the same room without armor on, and that was already more than either of them had expected. She didn't sleep well that night. Not because of the cold, or the thin cot, or Noah's small snoring presence beside her. She lay awake thinking about the man at the property line with his little book counting things that weren't his yet, and writing them down like they already were. She had met men like Clifford Hayes before. Different names, same face. The kind of man who understood that the easiest way to break someone wasn't to hit them. It was to take away everything they were holding on to and make them watch it go. She pressed her eyes closed and made herself breathe slow, and in the morning, she got up before dark and lit the stove and made biscuits because that was what she could do. That was always what she could do. Noah found Wade in the stable before breakfast that morning, without asking anyone's permission, which was exactly the kind of thing he did when he wanted something badly enough that he forgot to be cautious about it. Rosie found out about it only when Tommy came into the kitchen, looking amused and slightly scandalized. "Your boy walked straight up to Mr. Callahan while he was checking hooves on that gray mare," Tommy said, "and asked him what her name was." Rosie set down her spoon. And Mr. Callahan he just told him. Clara. The mare's name is Clara. And then Noah asked if he could brush her, and Mr. Callahan handed him the brush. Tommy shook his head like he was describing something mildly miraculous. "I've been working this ranch 8 months, and the man's never handed me so much as a nail without being asked twice." Rosie said nothing. She turned back to the stove. But she pressed her lips together around something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite pain, somewhere between the two, the way most things that mattered seemed to land. She knew what she was watching happen. She had known it was coming since the first morning when Wade had looked at Noah over his coffee cup with that expression she couldn't read. She had told herself it was just a man being unexpectedly kind to a child, which happened sometimes even with men who had shut most of themselves away. She had told herself it meant nothing in particular. But Noah had his father's way of standing still, his father's particular silence. The way he tilted his head when he was listening to something just slightly to the left like he was trying to hear around the corner of a sound. She had noticed it from the first week after Noah came to her when he was 3 years old, and his mother was dying in a bed in a boarding house in Lubbock, and she had thought then that she was probably imagining it, that grief and exhaustion were making her see things that weren't there. She didn't think she was imagining it now. Clara Whitfield had told her in those last lucid days before the fever took her completely that the father was a rancher, that she had loved him and he hadn't known about the baby, and she had been too proud and too frightened to tell him, that his name was Wade. She had said the name once clearly and then never said it again, and Rosie had filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things she was not yet ready to look at directly. She had not expected to end up here. She had not planned any of this. She stood at the stove and kept her back very straight and her hands very steady, and reminded herself that whatever happened next, she had made a promise to a dying woman to keep that child safe and loved and whole, and she intended to keep it regardless of what it cost her. What it might cost her was something she was not ready to count yet. She heard Noah laugh from outside, a real laugh, high and bright and unguarded, and she heard faintly lower the sound of something that might have been a man chuckling. And she pressed one hand flat against the warm iron of the stove and breathed. The trouble with Garrett came at noon. She had known it was coming. She had felt it building for days in the way he watched her from across the room in the small tests he set for her that she passed without acknowledging. They were tests in the particular way he had of making neutral observations that weren't neutral at all. He came into the kitchen when she was alone and stood with his arms crossed and said, "I want to ask you something and I want a straight answer." "All right," she said and kept chopping. "What are you really doing here?" She set down the knife and turned around. "I beg your pardon." "Women like you don't answer mail-order ads for broke cattle ranches in West Texas," he said. "Women like you end up in that situation, no money kid in tow, middle of winter, there's a story behind it. I want to know what the story is before it becomes Wade's problem." She looked at him for a long moment. "Women like me," she repeated. He didn't flinch, which she respected, even as it made her angry. "I've worked for Wade Callahan for 6 years," he said. "He's had enough problems. I don't want you to be another one." "That's fair," she said. Here's my straight answer. I spent 7 years working for other people's families because I had no family of my own. I raised a child alone without a penny of help from anyone. I answered that ad because I needed work and a roof and a chance to be somewhere long enough to make something real. And I didn't have the luxury of being choosy about what it looked like from the outside. She picked up her knife. If that makes me a problem to you, Garrett, you can go tell Mr. Callahan and let him decide. But if you're asking me whether I have any intention of hurting this ranch or the people in it, the answer is no, and I don't intend to say it again. He was quiet for a long moment. Something worked in his jaw. The men like you, he said finally. Not an apology, just a fact laid down. I know, she said. Tommy especially, he's easy. Despite everything, the corner of Garrett's mouth moved. He's a puppy in boots, he said. And then he turned and walked out, and when he came in for supper that night, he refilled her water pitcher, without being asked, which was about as close to a white flag as a man like Garrett was ever going to get. The night it all shifted was a Tuesday. Wade had gone into town for supplies, which he rarely did himself, and had done that day because he needed to speak to the bank, which meant whatever conversation had happened, there was not one he was going to share without being pushed into it. Rosie could tell by how he came through the door, hat still on coat, still buttoned the walk of a man carrying something invisible and heavy. He sat at the kitchen table, and she put coffee in front of him, and Noah, who had no sense of social subtlety, and also no fear of Wade anymore, climbed up onto the bench beside him, and said, "Did something bad happen?" Wade looked at him. "Why do you ask?" "Because you look like Miss Rosie looked when the axle broke on the wagon," Noah said. "Like you're figuring out how bad it is before you let yourself be upset about it." Rosie kept her eyes on the pot she was stirring. Wade was quiet for a moment. "The bank extended the note," he said at last. Not to Noah, but not away from him either. 90 days. After that... He stopped, drank his coffee. "After that what?" Noah asked. "After that, I'll need a different kind of answer than I have right now." Noah thought about this with the seriousness of a boy who has had real problems, and knows the difference between real ones and pretend ones. "Miss Rosie always says there's another road if you can't see it yet," he said. Wade looked at him. Something changed in his face, not the barely there thing from before, but something rawer, something that came from a deeper place than he had meant to let show. He looked at Noah the way a man looks at something he recognizes without being able to say where he's seen it before. His eyes moved to Rosie. She was still stirring the pot. Her back was to both of them, but her shoulders had gone very still, and her hand on the wooden spoon had stopped moving. "That where he learned that," Wade said. Quiet. Direct. "Yes," she said. "Just that." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from any that had come before. It had weight to it, shape to it, like a question that hadn't been asked yet, but was already in the room. Wade set down his cup. He looked at Noah for a long time. The line of the boy's jaw, the way he tilted his head just slightly to the left. When he spoke again, his voice was very careful, the way a man's voice gets when he's trying to keep it level and not entirely succeeding. "What was your mama's name, son?" Noah looked up at him with those wide, dark eyes. "Clara," he said. "Her name was Clara Whitfield." The coffee cup in Wade's hand hit the table with a sound like a small gunshot. Rosie did not turn around. She stood very still at the stove with the wooden spoon in her hand, and her heart doing something loud and irregular in her chest, and she waited for the world to rearrange itself around the thing that had just happened, because she had known on some level since the moment she walked through this gate that this moment was coming. She had just not known if she was ready for it. Behind her, the kitchen was absolutely silent, and then Noah said in a small wondering voice, "Did you know my mama?" Wade did not answer right away. He sat with both hands flat on the table and his eyes on Noah's face, and the silence stretched long enough that even Noah, who had a child's instinct for when adults needed a moment, went very still and waited. "Clara Whitfield," Wade said again. Slower this time, like he was hearing the name from the inside of a long tunnel. "From Lubbock," She was from Lubbock before, Noah said carefully. She moved around a lot after. She said she was looking for somewhere that felt right. He paused. She never found it. Wade pushed back from the table. He stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room and one hand pressed against the frame, and Rosie could see from where she stood that his shoulders were doing the thing shoulders do when a man is trying very hard not to fall apart in front of a child. She set down the wooden spoon. She turned around. "Noah," she said quietly, "go check on Clara for me. Make sure she's got enough water." Noah looked at her, then at Wade's back, then back at her. He was a perceptive child. He slid off the bench without another word and went out the back door, and the sound of his boots on the steps faded into the cold evening air. The kitchen was so quiet, Rosie could hear the fire in the stove. "How long have you known?" Wade said. His voice was controlled, barely. "I suspected from the first day," she said. "The way he stands, the way he tilts his head." She paused. "Clara told me his father was a rancher named Wade. That was all she told me. She said she'd been too proud to say anything when it happened, and then too sick to do anything about it later." She kept her voice even. "I didn't come here to force your hand. I want you to know that. I answered the ad because I needed work and because Noah needed stability. I wasn't going to say anything until I was sure." Wade turned around. His face was something she had never seen on him before. Stripped down, the careful blankness gone, something raw and undefended underneath it. "And now?" "And now you're sure," she said. "And so am I." He looked at her for a long moment. "How old is he?" 7. He'll be 8 in March. Something moved through Wade's expression, like weather moving through a clear sky, fast and total. 8 years, he said half to himself. "She didn't want to be a burden," Rosie said. "That's how she saw it. That you had the ranch and your life, and she had—" She stopped. "She loved you. Whatever she did or didn't do about it, she loved you. She told me that when she was dying and she had no reason left to say anything that wasn't true." Wade sat back down. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands, and he stayed that way for a long moment. And Rosie stood across from him and didn't try to fill the silence with anything, because some silences don't need to be filled. They need to be witnessed. When he lifted his head, his eyes were red at the corners. He didn't apologize for it. "Why did she come to you?" he said. "She worked at the boarding house where I had a room. We were both alone and we looked out for each other." Rosie sat down across from him. "When she got sick, I helped her. When she died, I kept Noah because there was nobody else, and because by then he was mine. Not by blood, but mine." Wade looked at her steadily. "You raised another woman's child alone for 4 years." "Yes, without telling the father. I didn't know where you were. Clara never said your last name. I found you the same way you'd find anything, through long looking and a little luck." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you for anything, Wade. I need you to understand that. I'm not here to make demands or rearrange your life. I came here to work, and I'm going to keep working, and what you do with what I've just told you is your decision." "He's my son." The way he said it was not a question and not an accusation. It was a man picking up something heavy and holding it to see if he could carry it. "Yes," Rosie said. "He is." "Then it's not just my decision," Wade said. And the look on his face when he said it, the first real, unguarded, undefended thing she had seen from him, made something in Rosie's chest pull tight in a way she was not prepared for. She was still sitting with that feeling, still working out what to do with it, when Garrett came through the back door at a run. He never ran. "Wade!" Garrett's voice was wrong, clipped and hard in the way that meant something bad had already started. "South fence is cut. 3 sections. Cattle are scattered into Henderson's draw." Wade was on his feet before Garrett finished the sentence. "How many men does Henderson have on his boundary tonight?" "None. His hands are in town." Garrett looked at Rosie once briefly. This wasn't kids or a drifter. The cuts were clean, professional. Somebody knew exactly where to hit. "Hayes," Wade said. It wasn't a question either. "His man was back at the property line this afternoon, Tommy saw him. Wade was already moving toward the door. He stopped and looked back at Rosie. Something passed between them, fast, wordless. The kind of communication that doesn't need time to develop, that just exists between two people who have been paying attention to each other. "Lock the doors," he said. "Keep Noah inside." "I will," she said. "Be careful." He held her eyes for one beat longer than necessary. Then he was gone, and Garrett behind him, and the sound of boots and voices and horses followed for a few minutes, and then faded, and Rosie was alone in the kitchen with the fire in the stove and the weight of everything that had just happened sitting on her chest like a stone. She locked the doors. She got Noah from the stable and told him they were staying inside tonight, and he read her face well enough not to argue. She sat at the table with her mending, and he sat across from her with his book, and the two of them were quiet together in the way they had been quiet together for 4 years. The specific, practiced quiet of two people who know how to wait out the dark. An hour passed. Then 2. Then she smelled the smoke. She was at the window before she had consciously decided to move. The barn. The east side of the barn, the side Wade had said needed a new roof, was throwing light into the dark that didn't belong there, orange and climbing, and alive in the terrible way fire is alive. "Noah." Her voice was level. "Go to the root cellar. Now." "What's happening?" "Root cellar. Now. Do not come out until I come for you." He knew her voice. He knew the difference between the voice that asked and the voice that had no room for questions. He was out of his chair and moving, but she was already moving too. She grabbed the wool blanket from the back of the chair and the bucket from beside the door, and she went out into the cold dark at a run, and the cold hit her like a wall, and the light from the barn was brighter than it had looked from the window, and someone was already shouting. Tommy was at the well cranking the handle with both arms, his face lit orange and white with terror and effort. "Miss Rosie, you can't— Where are the horses?" She was already at the barn door. The heat pushed against her face like a hand. "The horses are out. We got the horses out." Tommy's voice cracked. "But there's someone in there, I thought I heard." She went in. The heat was a living thing. It pressed against every inch of her, pushed into her lungs. When she breathed, turned the world into a roaring orange blur of noise and light and choking. She pulled the edge of the blanket up over her mouth and moved along the wall, keeping low, calling out. "Is someone here? Call out if you can hear me." Nothing. Then a sound, small, high, coming from the back corner near the tack room. She moved toward it. Noah. He was crouched in this corner behind an overturned feed barrel, both arms over his head, and she understood in a single cold instant that he had not gone to the root cellar, that he had followed her, that he had come in behind her and gotten turned around in the smoke. And he was 7 years old, and she could not see the ceiling anymore for the fire. "Noah." She was beside him. She pulled him up against her body and wrapped the blanket around both of them. I have you, sweetheart, hold on to me." "I'm sorry," he was saying over and over, his voice barely there. I'm sorry. "Hold on," she said. "Hold on to me." She turned back toward where she thought the door was. The smoke had changed the room into something unrecognizable, and the roaring was everywhere, and she kept one arm locked around Noah and moved forward, and hit a wall that was not the door, and turned and moved again. "Rosie!" Wade's voice, close, cutting through the roaring with the particular frequency of a voice she had already learned to track without trying. "Here," she said. "I'm here." He found them in the dark, the way you find something you've already memorized, fast and certain and without hesitation. His hands closed around her arm and Noah's, and he pulled them both forward, moving fast, and then the heat shifted, and the door was there, and they were through it, and the cold outside air hit her like water. She went to her knees. Noah was still in her arms. She could feel him shaking, or maybe she was shaking, or both. She pulled back and looked at his face, eyes streaming soot on his cheeks, alive and whole and breathing, and she pulled him back against her chest and held him there. "Miss Rosie." His voice was muffled against her shoulder. "I didn't go to the cellar." "I know," she said. I was scared you'd get lost." She pressed her face against the top of his head. "I know," she said again. Behind her, she heard Wade come down to the ground beside her. She heard the sounds of men fighting the fire with water and wet sacking. She heard Garrett's voice giving sharp-clipped orders. She heard the barn groaning as the roof on the east side gave way and came down in a shower of sparks and red light. And then she heard nothing but Noah breathing, and Wade's voice low and close saying her name. Rosie. She lifted her head. Wade was kneeling in front of her. He had soot on his face, and his hands and one side of his coat was scorched black. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her across the table when Noah said Clara's name, with everything down and nothing between them and the thing that was actually there. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. She looked at him more carefully. "Are you—" "No." He looked at Noah. Something crossed his face that she didn't have a word for, or rather she had one, but it was too large and too sudden to look at directly. His hand came up, and he touched the back of Noah's head very briefly, very carefully. The way you touch something you're only just beginning to understand is yours. Noah felt it. He pulled back from Rosie's shoulder and looked at Wade with his streaming eyes and his soot-covered face. And then he did something Rosie had never seen him do with any man before. He leaned forward and put his head against Wade's chest. Wade went completely still. And then slowly, carefully, like a man learning something he should have known for years, he wrapped one arm around the boy and held on. Rosie sat in the cold and the orange light and watched it happen, and felt the thing in her chest break open. Not the painful breaking, but the other kind. The kind you've been bracing against for so long that when it finally comes, you realize the brace was the thing that hurt. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. She was not going to cry in front of everyone. She had never cried in front of anyone if she could help it. But Noah felt her move because he always knew where she was, and he reached out one arm without lifting his head from Wade's chest and found her hand and held it. And there they were, 3 people in the dirt and the firelight holding on to each other while everything burned and the cold went on forever around them. Garrett appeared above them with a lantern. He looked down at the 3 of them, and his face went through several things in quick succession that he would never in his life admit to. Then he cleared his throat. "Fire's out. Mostly. East wall is gone, but we saved the structure." He paused. 6 head of cattle are missing from the south pasture. Hayes's men, somebody saw 2 riders heading north before the fire started. Wade lifted his head. He did not let go of Noah. "Did anyone see their faces?" "Tommy says he recognized one of them. Works for Hayes. Blonde fellow rides a Pinto." "That's enough," Wade said. "That's more than enough." His voice had gone flat and quiet in the way that is more dangerous than loud. He looked at Garrett. "Tomorrow morning, first light. I want every piece of this documented. The fence cuts the missing cattle tonight. Everything." He paused. "I'm taking this to the marshal." Garrett's eyebrows went up. "The marshal's in Hayes's pocket." "Then I'm going over his head," Wade said, "to the federal land office in Abilene. Hayes has been cutting fences and running cattle off from at least 4 spreads in this county. I've got names. I've got dates. I've been keeping records for a year because I knew this day was coming." He looked at Garrett steadily. "He wants me to be alone and broke and out of options when I go up against him. I've been letting him think that." A pause. "He miscounted something tonight." Garrett looked at Rosie, then at Noah, then back at Wade, and something settled in his face, a long-held uncertainty finally resolved. "I'll have Tommy start writing it down tonight," he said. "Good." Garrett walked away. Tommy was beside the well shaking from cold or shock or both, and Rosie heard Garrett say something to him in a low voice and heard Tommy let out a shaky breath. Noah had fallen half asleep against Wade's shoulder. Children could do that, survive something terrible, and be asleep inside 10 minutes because the body decides that sleep is the most useful available option. Wade looked at Rosie over the boy's head. She looked back at him. "He followed you in," Wade said quietly. "He went in there because he was afraid for you." "I know. That's—" He stopped, tried again. 4 years ago, this child had nobody, and now he runs into burning buildings for you. That's what love does, Rosie said, simply, without ceremony. Wade was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. I'm starting to recollect that. And Rosie, who had survived cruelty and poverty and loneliness and years of being looked at like she was too much or not enough, sat in the cold dirt of the Callahan Ranch with soot on her face and a broken barn at her back, and felt for the first time in longer than she could count that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't know yet what the morning would bring. She didn't know what Wade would do with what he knew, or what Clifford Hayes would try next, or what the federal land office in Abilene would say when one broke rancher walked in with a year's worth of documents and 2 witnesses and a burned barn. What she knew was that Wade Callahan had just held his son for the first time, and that nobody, not Hayes, not the town, not the bank, not the cold, had managed to stop it. That counted for something. That counted for everything. The morning after the fire, Wade Callahan sat at the kitchen table with a tin box in front of him that he hadn't opened in front of anyone before. Rosie set coffee down beside him and didn't ask. She went back to the stove. Noah, still moving a little stiffly from the smoke the night before, sat across from Wade and watched him with the steady, unself-conscious attention of a child who has not yet learned that staring is rude. Wade opened the box. Inside were letters, receipts, hand-drawn maps with dates written in the margins, a ledger with 3 columns, dates, incidents, witnesses, 47 entries over 14 months, written in the same careful, unhurried hand as the letter that had brought Rosie here. How long did it take you to build all this? Rosie asked without turning around. Since the second time his men cut my fence, Wade said. I knew the marshal wasn't going to help, so I started keeping track myself. He set a folded paper on top of the pile. Last week I got a letter back from a federal land agent in Abilene, man named Horace Birch. He said if I could document a pattern of systematic harassment and property theft across multiple landowners, he'd open an investigation. Rosie turned around. And can you? I've got my records. I spent yesterday evening writing to 3 other ranchers Hayes has been squeezing the Hendersons, the Pratt family over on the South Fork, old man Dillard, who lost his place entirely 6 months ago. He looked up at her. If they'll sign statements, I've got a pattern. They'll sign, Garrett said from the doorway. He came in and poured his own coffee without being invited, which was new. 3 weeks ago, he would have waited to be asked. Henderson's been waiting for someone to go first. He told me himself. He said he didn't have the nerve to do it alone. Nobody does anything alone, Wade said. He looked at the box. That's what Hayes is counting on. Then prove him wrong, Rosie said. He looked at her across the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the tin box full of 14 months of patience in front of him, and for a moment he just looked at her, and she let him, because she understood that sometimes a person needs to borrow another person's certainty when their own runs thin. Yeah, he said. That's the plan. He left for Abilene the next morning before the sun was fully up, and Rosie stood on the porch and watched the wagon disappear down the frozen road and felt the particular fear of someone who has been let down by enough things to know that hope is not a guarantee. She felt it, and she acknowledged it, and then she went inside and started breakfast because that was always the thing to do. Wade was gone for 3 days. In those 3 days, Rosie kept the ranch running with the same quiet, absolute competence she had brought to everything since the day she arrived. The men were fed. The fires were kept. Noah helped Tommy mend the damaged fence sections with a seriousness that made Tommy treat him like a real hand rather than a child underfoot, which Noah accepted with solemn dignity. But the town did not stay quiet while Wade was gone. On the second day, Rosie took Noah to the Sunday service because Noah had asked to go, and she had never in her life let fear of other people's opinions change what she did for that child. She put on her best dress, which was not fancy, but was clean and well kept, and she walked into the Red Rock Community Church with Noah's hand in hers, and her chin level, and her eyes straight ahead. She heard the whispers before they were halfway up the aisle. She found a seat near the back and sat down, and Noah sat beside her and opened the hymnal to the right page without being told, because she had taught him to do that, and she held the book and kept her eyes on the front of the room and breathed. The two women from the dry goods store were 3 rows ahead. She recognized the back of their hats. She didn't need to see their faces to know what they were saying. After the service in the yard outside, it happened, the way these things always happened, gradually and then all at once. One of the women, the first one, the one with the sore voice, stepped directly into Rosie's path with the precision of someone who had planned it on the walk over. "You're the Callahan woman," she said. Not a question. A statement designed to make someone feel small. "I'm Rosie Bennett," Rosie said. "I work at the Callahan Ranch." The woman looked her up and down with slow, deliberate thoroughness. "Well, I suppose Wade Callahan takes what he can get these days given his circumstances." The yard had gone the way yards go when something like this starts, not fully quiet, but that particular quality of reduced noise that means people are listening without wanting to look like they're listening. Rosie felt Noah's hand tighten in hers. She squeezed back once. She kept her voice even. "I reckon Mr. Callahan knows exactly what he's got," she said. "And I reckon that's between him and me." A man of his standing, the woman continued loud enough to reach the people pretending not to listen. "Taking in a woman nobody knows with a child nobody can account for, that's enough." The voice came from behind Rosie, and every head in the churchyard turned, because it was a voice people in Red Rock had learned to pay attention to, not because it was loud, but because in 6 years it had never said more than was necessary, which meant when it said something, it meant it. Wade Callahan stood at the gate of the churchyard with his hat in his hand and mud still on his boots from the road, and he looked at the woman who had been speaking with an expression that was perfectly polite and absolutely immovable. He had come back early. He walked through the gate and across the yard, and the crowd parted, the way crowds part for a man who is not asking them to, and he stopped beside Rosie and looked at her for exactly 1 moment, checking, making sure she was all right. And then he looked at the woman. "Mrs. Alderman," he said, "I believe you were saying something about my household." Mrs. Alderman blinked. Whatever she had expected from this moment, it was not Wade Callahan himself standing in front of her fresh from the road, calm as a man discussing the weather. "I was simply observing." "Then let me help with your observations," Wade said. His voice was even and unhurried and carrying in the still winter air. "Rosie Bennett kept my ranch running, fed my men, and ran into a burning barn to save a child's life while I was away. She did it without being asked, and without expecting anything for it." He paused. "I'm not aware of what standard you're measuring her against, but whatever it is, she cleared it by a considerable distance." The churchyard was very quiet. Mrs. Alderman's face had gone through several colors. "Wade Callahan. I don't think—" "Her heart," Wade said, "is worth more than every polished opinion in this yard combined." He held the woman's gaze for 1 steady beat. Then he turned to Rosie. "You ready to go home?" Rosie looked at him. She did not trust her voice entirely, so she nodded. "Good." He set his hat back on his head and offered her his arm, not tentatively, not apologetically, but in the straightforward way of a man who has decided something and is done deliberating about it, and she took it, and they walked out of the churchyard together with Noah on her other side, and Rosie kept her eyes forward and her chin level, and did not look at anyone, not because she was ashamed, but because she did not need to. Behind them the yard started buzzing. She didn't need to hear the words. They were halfway down the road before she spoke. "You came back early." "I got what I needed on the second day," he said. Birch opened the investigation. Henderson and the Pratt family both signed statements. Dillard signed his over the telegraph from Tennessee. He paused. "Hayes is going to have a federal agent sitting on his doorstep by the end of the week." "That's it. It's over." "The legal part started," Wade said. "Whether it goes where it needs to go depends on Birch and what he finds. But Hayes knows I went to Abilene. He knows I didn't go alone. And a man like that—" He paused. "A man like that does his best work in the dark. Once there's light on what he's been doing, most of what he's got falls apart." Noah, who had been walking between them in thoughtful silence, said, Is he going to come back and burn something else? I don't think so, Wade said. But we're going to be watchful for a while regardless. I can watch, Noah said seriously. I wake up early. I know you do, Wade said, and his voice had that thing in it that it got sometimes when he spoke to the boy, a note underneath the regular notes, something deep and careful, and still finding its footing. I was counting on it. Noah looked up at him and smiled quick and bright, the smile Rosie had seen maybe 6 times in 4 years, and still felt like finding sunlight in a cold room. Then he ran ahead to open the ranch gate, and Wade and Rosie walked through together in silence that was not empty. You didn't have to do that, Rosie said. In the churchyard. I know, Wade said. Those women will be talking for a month. Probably. It doesn't bother you. He was quiet for a moment. What bothers me, he said, is that you had to stand there and listen to it alone. That's what I'm not willing to have happen again. Rosie looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, the brim of his hat low against the flat winter light, and he had the expression of a man who has said what he meant and is prepared to stand behind it and isn't going to dress it up any further. She didn't know what to do with that. She had spent so long living in a world that looked at her and found reasons to diminish her that she had, without fully realizing, it started building those reasons in herself. Starting to believe them a little, the way water believes in the shape of the vessel it's been poured into long enough. She breathed in the cold air. She breathed it out. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. I was late. I should have been there from the beginning. 2 weeks later, the federal agent arrived. Horace Birch was a compact, gray-templed man with a leather satchel and the eyes of someone who has spent 20 years watching people lie to him and has stopped being surprised by it. He came to the ranch first, sat at Rosie's kitchen table, drank 2 cups of her coffee, and read every document in Wade's tin box, with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who gets paid to be thorough. When he finished, he closed the box and looked at Wade. You kept good records. I was an accountant before I was a rancher, Wade said. Birch blinked. Rosie hid a smile. I'm going to need all of these, Birch said, tapping the box. I'll give you copies. They're yours, Wade said. Birch looked at Rosie. You were present for some of these incidents. Several, Rosie said. The fence cuts the missing cattle the fire. I may need a statement. You'll have it, she said. He nodded once, closed his satchel, and stood up. Mr. Callahan, I want to be honest with you. Hayes has money and he has lawyers, and this is going to take time. But what you've put together here... He paused. I've opened investigations on a lot less. After he left, Wade stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. Then he let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. Garrett, who had been sitting at the end of the table, said nothing, but he reached over and refilled his own coffee cup and Wade's without being asked, which was for Garrett a fairly significant gesture. What happens now? Tommy asked from the back of the room. He had been so quiet, everyone had forgotten he was there. Now we wait, Wade said, and we keep working. That's all? That's everything, Rosie said. The days that followed had a different quality to them. Not easy, not resolved, but different. The tightness that had lived in the ranch like a second weather system began to ease. The men came in for meals and stayed at the table longer than they needed to. Tommy started teaching Noah to play cards badly, and the sounds of their arguments drifted in from the bunkhouse porch in the evenings and made Rosie shake her head and smile at the stove. Wade started coming in from the pasture earlier. Not much earlier. An hour maybe. But Rosie noticed because she noticed everything, and she didn't say anything about it, and he didn't explain it, and that was all right. One evening he came in and found her sitting at the table helping Noah with his letters. Noah had been behind for his age when he came to her, and she had been teaching him herself since he was 4, and he was catching up fast, which she had known he would, because the boy was sharp, and Wade stopped in the doorway, the way he always did, and looked at them, and then he came and sat down at the table and picked up one of the practice sheets and said to Noah, "You spelled ranch wrong." Noah peered at the paper. "I always spell that one wrong." "R-A-N-C-H," Wade said. "Say it back." "R-A-N-C-H." Again. "R-A-N-C-H." Noah looked at him sideways. "You're bossy." "I'm a rancher," Wade said. "It's a requirement." Rosie looked at the two of them from across the table and felt something settle in her. Not with a click, not with any drama. Just a slow, quiet settling like a house after the wind dies down. Like something that has been shifting, finally finding its ground. She had been so afraid, without quite admitting it to herself, that coming here would cost her Noah. That once the truth came out, once Wade knew, he would want to claim his son in a way that left her on the outside. She had kept that fear folded small and hidden even from herself, because it was the one thing she had no road around. But Wade Callahan had not tried to take anything. He had not made demands. He had not asked her to step back or move aside or redefine herself in relation to what he needed. He had simply gradually, carefully, in the particular way that men who have learned their lessons the hard way, learn things move toward them both. Not toward one at the expense of the other. Toward them, as the thing they already were. She had not let herself believe that was possible. She was beginning to reconsider. The letter from Horace Birch arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks later. Wade opened it at the table with Rosie and Garrett watching and read it through once. Then he set it down. "Hayes has been charged," he said. "Federal counts of fraud, land theft, and criminal intimidation. 14 ranchers in 3 counties. He paused. "His assets are frozen pending investigation. The land pressure stops." Garrett let out a breath. Long, slow. The breath of a man who has been bracing for a long time and is only now allowing himself to stop. Tommy from the doorway said, "So it's over." "The worst of it," Wade said. "The ranch is safe." Wade looked at the letter, then at Rosie. "Yeah," he said. "The ranch is safe." Tommy made a sound that was almost a whoop and strangled it halfway out, which made Garrett close his eyes briefly in the manner of a man asking for patience. But even Garrett's mouth moved. Noah came in from outside with his boots muddy from the yard, took one look at the room and said, "Something good happened." "Something good happened," Rosie confirmed. He pumped his fist once fast and fierce and pure and then composed himself back to dignity, which took approximately 3 seconds. "Does that mean we're staying?" he asked. Nobody had said that word out loud before. Staying. Not in that particular way with that particular weight on it. Rosie looked at Wade. Wade looked at Rosie. "Yeah," Wade said. And he was looking at her when he said it, not at Noah. And his voice had that thing in it again, the deep note underneath the regular notes, the one she had stopped pretending she didn't hear. "You're staying." And Rosie Bennett, who had spent her whole life bracing for the next door to close, felt something in her chest go still, and warm and certain in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. She nodded once. She turned back to the stove, but her hands when she picked up the spoon were shaking just slightly, just for a moment, not from fear, but from the opposite of fear. And she was glad she was facing away from the room, so nobody could see the expression on her face. Nobody except Garrett, who happened to glance up at that exact moment, and who looked quickly away, and who went out of his way for the rest of the day to be particularly unhelpful and gruff about everything, which was how Garrett handled emotions he didn't have a category for. The ranch hands learned to recognize that look. It meant something good was being held close and quiet, the way good things need to be held sometimes before they're ready to be spoken. Outside, the winter light was changing. Not quite spring yet. But something in the air had shifted thin and pale and pointing toward something warmer. Something that was coming whether or not anyone was ready for it. Inside the Callahan Ranch kitchen, the fire in the stove burned steady, and the coffee was hot, and Noah spelled ranch correctly 3 times in a row, and Wade said, "Again, anyway," and Rosie stood at the stove and let herself believe carefully with both hands in the road she hadn't been able to see from where she was standing. It was right here. It had been right here the whole time. Spring came to the Callahan Ranch the way it always comes to West Texas. Not gently, Not all at once, but in fits and arguments, cold one morning and almost warm the next, the land itself undecided about whether it was ready to let go of winter. Rosie noticed it first in the kitchen, the way the light through the window came in at a different angle than it had the week before. Then in Noah, who started leaving his coat on the hook by the door instead of pulling it on the moment he went outside. Then in the men who stopped hunching their shoulders when they came in and started leaving the back door open a crack while they ate. She noticed it in Wade last, and that was only because she had been trying very hard not to notice anything about Wade that wasn't strictly practical. She wasn't succeeding. He had changed since the night of the fire. Not dramatically, Wade Callahan was not a man given to dramatic change, but in the small cumulative ways that add up to something significant when you're paying attention. He came in from the pasture and sat at the table and talked. Not just about the ranch, not just about the practical concerns of cattle and fences, and the slow grinding business of rebuilding what Hayes's men had damaged. He talked the way a man talks when he has remembered that talking to someone is different from reporting to them, and better. He talked about his father, who had built this ranch from nothing and died leaving it half-finished. About the years before Clara and the years after, and the particular kind of loneliness that lives in a big house when you've decided the house is all you're going to allow yourself. He talked about the debt and what it had cost him in sleep and pride. He talked about Noah carefully at first, then less carefully, then with the ease of a man who has stopped being afraid of how much he means it. And Rosie listened, the way she always listened, with her full attention and without pushing. And after a while, she realized that somewhere between December and March, without either of them making a decision about it, they had become the kind of people who told each other things. That scared her more than the fire had. The morning it broke open was a Thursday in late March, ordinary in every way except that it wasn't. Wade came in early from the south pasture. She heard his boots on the steps and looked up surprised, because it was barely past 8 and he came through the door and stopped and looked at her, the way he'd been looking at her for weeks, the way she'd been carefully not looking directly at, and said, "I need to say something." "All right," she said. She set down her knife. She turned to face him fully because whatever this was, it deserved to be faced fully. He took off his hat. He turned it in his hands once. "I've been working up to this for a while," he said. "I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm better with a ledger than I am with words. You should know that going in." "I know that," she said. "I know you do." He looked at her. "When you came here, I had a ranch that was falling apart, and a tin box full of evidence that nobody wanted to hear, and a son I didn't know existed. I was holding on to this place out of stubbornness more than anything real." He paused. "Now I've got reasons." Rosie's hands were very still at her sides. "You're one of them," he said. "I need you to know that. Not because you cook, or because you kept the men in line, or because you walked into a burning barn, although all of that is true and none of it is small. Because of who you are when you think nobody's paying attention. Because of the way you love that boy. Because every morning when I come through that door, you make this place feel like it's worth fighting for. And I didn't know how much I needed that until you were here, and I couldn't imagine it without you anymore." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, Tommy was talking to the gray mare in the tone of a man who believes horses understand more than they let on. "I'm not asking you to be something different than what you are," Wade said. "I'm not asking you to be smaller or quieter or easier to explain to this town. I'm asking you—" He stopped again. His jaw worked. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to stay. Not as the cook. Not because of the arrangement. As my wife. If that's something you'd want." Rosie looked at him for a long moment. She had been alone for a long time. Not just since Clara died. Not just since she'd picked up Noah and started walking alone the way a person is alone, when the world has spent years telling them their size and their circumstances, and the particular shape of their life means they should expect less. Should need less. Should ask for less. She had believed it more than she'd admitted to herself, and believing it had been the loneliest thing of all. "Wade Callahan," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. "I have been in this kitchen since December, and in that time I have watched you hold your son for the first time, and stand up in a churchyard for a woman this town decided wasn't worth defending, and drive to Abilene alone with a tin box full of other people's hope. She looked at him directly. "You are asking the wrong question." He blinked. "I am. The question isn't whether I'd want it," she said. "I'd want it. I've wanted it longer than I'm going to admit to you in this kitchen on a Thursday morning." She stopped. "Let that land. The question is whether you understand what you're getting. I'm not going to shrink. I'm not going to apologize for how I look, or how much space I take up, or what this town thinks of me. I'm not going to become something easier. I know that," he said. "I'm going to keep being exactly what I am, Rosie." His voice was quiet and certain. "That's what I'm asking for." She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she picked up her knife, turned back to the cutting board, and said, "Then yes." A beat. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. She didn't turn around. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she was not going to let him see that yet. "Now go tell Garrett before he figures it out himself and acts like he knew first." She heard him make a sound that was unmistakably a short laugh, real and unguarded, the laugh of a man who has not laughed like that in a long time, and is surprised to find he still knows how. Then she heard his boots cross the floor, and then she felt his hand on her shoulder, just briefly, warm and steady, and then he was gone back out the door. She set down the knife. She pressed both hands flat on the table. She looked at the wall. She breathed in once slow and let it go, and the feeling that moved through her was so large and so various that she couldn't name it as any one thing. It was relief. It was grief for how long it had taken. It was joy so acute it hurt at the edges. It was the particular quality of a woman who has carried something heavy alone for years and is only now putting it down and feeling the full weight of what it was. She was still standing there when Noah came in the back door. He looked at her. He stopped. "What happened?" "Wade asked me something," she said. Noah's eyes went sharp with that particular intelligence of his. "What did he ask?" "He asked me to marry him." Noah was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, "What did you say?" "I said yes." The sound he made was not a whoop and not a cry and not quite a word. It was something underneath all of those things, the raw sound of a child who has been waiting for something without letting himself believe it was coming, and it arriving anyway. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and hit her around the middle with both arms, and she caught him and held on, and they stood there in the kitchen, not saying anything, and Rosie pressed her face into his hair and let herself feel all of it without managing any of it. After a minute, Noah said muffled against her middle, "Does that mean he's staying?" "That means he's staying," she said. "Forever." "Forever's the idea, yes." He tightened his arms once more, fierce and brief. Then he pulled back and composed himself back to dignity, which still took about 3 seconds. "I'm going to go tell Clara," he said, meaning the mayor. "You do that," Rosie said. He ran out the door, and she laughed, really laughed the way she hadn't in longer than she could remember, and the sound of it surprised her how much space it took up in the room, how right it sounded in there. The wedding was in May. It was not an elaborate affair. Rosie had not wanted elaborate, and Wade had not offered it, and neither of them had any interest in making the occasion about anything other than what it was. The preacher came to the ranch. The men stood on the porch in their best boots, cleaned and uncomfortable. Tommy had polished his hat so aggressively that Garrett told him it looked like he'd waxed it, which was true. Mrs. Alderman was not invited. Neither were the 2 women from the dry goods counter. Nobody mentioned this. Nobody needed to. The Henderson family came, and the Pratts and old man Dillard, who had made the trip from Tennessee specifically, he said, because he wanted to look Wade Callahan in the eye and thank him in person, and who cried openly during the ceremony in a way that embarrassed nobody except Tommy, who was also crying and trying to hide it behind his hat. Rosie wore a white dress that she had made herself from fabric she'd ordered from the catalog with her first full month's wages. It was simple, and it fit her well, and she had made it to fit herself exactly as she was, which was the only way she knew how to do anything. Wade, when he saw her come out of the house, stopped talking to the preacher mid-sentence and didn't say anything for a moment, and then said very quietly, "Lord Almighty." And the preacher pretended he hadn't heard that. The ceremony was short. The words were the old words, plain and unadorned, and Wade said them the same way he did everything, with his full attention on the thing in front of him, and nothing held back. When he put the ring on her finger, his hands were steady, and his eyes were on hers, and Rosie said her own words in a voice that did not shake, which she had not been entirely certain of ahead of time. When it was done, the men cheered, and Tommy's whoop, unrestrained, at last startled the gray mare into a brief canter in the paddock, which made Noah laugh so hard he had to sit down. The celebration was food and music, and the particular warm noise of a small group of people who have been through something hard together and are taking a moment to be glad. Garrett shook Wade's hand for longer than was strictly necessary, and then walked away quickly. Tommy hugged Rosie around the shoulders and said, "Thank you, ma'am," for no apparent reason, then turned red and went to stand by the horses. It was late afternoon when the crowd thinned and the ranch grew quiet again, and Rosie was sitting on the porch step with her shoes off and a cup of coffee in her hands, watching the light go long and golden across the pasture, when Noah came and sat down beside her. He sat close, the way he always sat, their shoulders touching. He was quiet for a minute. Then he said, "Miss Rosie." "Just Rosie," she said. "You don't need the miss anymore." He considered this. "Rosie," he said, trying the weight of it without the buffer. "Do you think my mama can see this?" Rosie looked out at the light on the grass. "I think she can," she said. "I think she's been watching the whole time." "Do you think she's happy about it?" "I think she's relieved," Rosie said. "She was always worried about you, about whether you'd be all right. That was the thing that hurt her most." She put her arm around him. "I think she knows you're all right now." Noah leaned into her. "I was always all right," he said. "I had you." Rosie pressed her lips together. She looked at the sky. "Yeah," she said. "You did." The sound of boots on the porch behind them, and then Wade sat down on the step on Noah's other side with his own coffee, and the three of them sat together in the evening light, and nobody said anything for a while, which was something they were all good at by now. The specific, easy quiet of people who don't need to fill the air between them to feel close. After a while, Noah said Wade. Wade looked down at him. He'd been Wade to the boy for a few weeks now, since the night Noah had decided on his own that it was right, and Wade had received it the way he received everything important, quietly, without ceremony, with everything in him paying attention. "Yeah. Are you really staying forever?" Wade looked at the boy, then at Rosie. Rosie looked back at him over Noah's head, and in the long light of the May evening, she could see exactly what she'd been learning to see for months. The man underneath the armor, real and present, and decided, looking back at her with the steady certainty of someone who has stopped running from the thing they most wanted and finally turned around to face it. Wade set down his cup. He put his arm around Noah's shoulders, and his other hand found Rosie's on the step between them, and he held both of them close in the unhurried way of a man with nowhere else to be. "This is my family," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Noah exhaled. It was a small sound, nearly nothing. The sound of a child releasing something he had been holding so long and so carefully that he'd stopped noticing the weight of it. He leaned into Wade's side and closed his eyes, and the evening light moved slow across the ranch, and the cattle were dark shapes in the green pasture, and somewhere near the stable, Clara was making her low, contented sound. Rosie looked out at all of it. Her land now, her porch, her men laughing somewhere near the bunkhouse, her boy asleep on his feet, her husband's hand warm in hers. She had arrived here with 38 cents and a broken wagon wheel and a child and the particular determination of a woman who has been told so many times what she is not worth that she has decided somewhere in the bone that the only possible response is to keep going. She had walked through that gate and stood in front of men who had already dismissed her and looked them in the eye and said she came to work, and then she had worked, and she had fed people and kept fires and run into burning buildings and told the truth when it was costly, and loved a child who wasn't hers by blood so completely and so long that the question of blood had become irrelevant. She had done all of that, and the world had looked at her and found her lacking, and she had kept going anyway. And here was what the world didn't understand, and would never understand, and what Rosie knew now, in her whole body, as the truth she had been earning her whole life. The right person does not love you after you have been made acceptable. The right person does not wait for you to become smaller, or quieter, or easier to defend. The right person walks up to the gate where the world has posted its judgments and knocks them aside without ceremony, and says with the whole of themselves that they see you, and they choose you, and they are not going anywhere. Wade Callahan had done that, and Rosie Bennett, Rosie Callahan, now on this porch in this light with her boy asleep against her husband's arm and her coffee going cold in her hand, and the Texas evening burning itself out across the sky in every color she had ever hoped for, had been worth choosing all along. She had always been worth choosing. She knew that now, and no one, not this town, not the cold, not the years of closed doors and cutting words and the particular cruelty of a world that measures women by what they are not. No one was ever going to take that from her again.